If you stood on the Pamir Plateau of Uzbekistan today, your lungs would labor for every 20% of oxygen you're missing. Your skin would crack in the -20-degree wind. It is a place where humans should not be. Yet, in February 2026, new Lidar data has revealed a city the size of Pompeii hidden in this thin air. A city built not for comfort, but for fire. This is Marsmanda. It is a world of black lung and high-carbon steel, where empires were forged in a place where men could barely breathe. The Pamir Highlands do not invite settlement. The air at 2,000 meters carries roughly 80% of the oxygen available at sea level, and winter temperatures regularly drop below -20 Celsius. By every standard metric of medieval urbanism, proximity to water, agricultural potential, and population carrying capacity, this plateau should be empty. But by the laws of 2026 archaeology, Marsmanda is a massive industrial impossibility. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, Echoes of Forgotten Lore. Beginning in late 2025 and running into early 2026. A joint survey team using LiDAR-mounted drone arrays and ground-penetrating geomagnetic instruments swept across a roughly 170-hectare zone in the Fergana-adjacent highlands east of Samarkand. What the data returned was not a village, was not a seasonal camp or a military outpost. The survey revealed the subsurface architecture of a city dense, organized, and purpose-built on a scale that had no business existing at this elevation. Archaeologists already had a name for this place, drawn from historical records that most scholars had treated as approximate or exaggerated. The medieval sources called it Marsmanda. The site is now more commonly identified by its modern Uzbek designation, Tugunbulak. The LiDAR returns showed a structured urban footprint covering over 100 hectares at the main settlement, with a secondary site, Tugunbulak, positioned roughly 12 kilometers to the south. While the full 2026 publication of the exact hectare count for this secondary zone is still finalized, the geomagnetic survey has already traced what appears to be a connective road corridor. What drove this city into existence at 2,000 meters was not agriculture. It was not trade access in the conventional sense. It was iron. The slag heaps at Tugunbulak are the first thing that changes how you think about the place. They are not incidental. They are not the byproduct of a blacksmith shop serving local needs. The accumulations of iron slag identified across the site represent industrial-scale metal production, organized, sustained, and running continuously across roughly 3 centuries. From the 8th through the 11th century CE. That window corresponds to the height of Samanid and early Karakonid political power across Central Asia, period when demand for high-quality iron for weapons, for agricultural tools, for the infrastructure of expanding cities in the lowlands was acute and competitive. The altitude, paradoxically, may have offered one specific advantage. Cooler ambient temperatures helped manage furnace heat differentials during certain production phases. While this thermodynamic hypothesis is currently under active analysis by the 2026 Survey Metallurgy team, the preliminary modeling suggests a high-altitude engineering masterclass. The furnaces weren't just built here despite the cold, they may have been built here because of it. The scale of what has been found forces a revision of assumptions that have governed Central Asian medieval archaeology for decades. The working model held that high-altitude sites in this region were, at best, secondary relay stations, seasonal extraction camps. The lowland cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, were where urban life happened. Tugunbulak does not fit that model. By the physical evidence of its footprint and its industrial infrastructure, it was a primary production center. It fed the lowlands. It did not depend on them for its identity. But data points and survey maps do not capture what it meant to actually live here. Consider the population required to sustain industrial iron production across 3 centuries at altitude. Smelters or haulers, charcoal producers, furnace tenders, water managers. None of these roles are part-time. None of them are casual. The people who built and maintained Tugunbulak were not passing through. They were committed, generation after generation, to a working life in thin air. In extreme cold, in proximity to furnaces running at temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius, their bodies adapted. Their social structures organized around the rhythms of production. The city grew because the iron kept flowing, and the iron kept flowing because the city held. To understand how that production actually worked, what the smelters knew, what the furnaces demanded, and why this particular process was worth sustaining at such cost, we have to go inside the metallurgy itself. The cemetery at Tugunbulak was not a mystery to the people who used it. It filled quickly. Bioarchaeological analysis of the skeletal remains recovered from the Tugunbulak burial site, published as part of the 2025 to 2026 survey findings, produced a profile that is consistent across multiple individuals and multiple generations. The bones tell a specific story. The rib cages are enlarged, not through genetic variation, but through lifelong mechanical adaptation to low oxygen air. Forensic osteologists describe this morphology clinically as barrel chest, a compensatory expansion of thoracic volume that develops in populations living at sustained altitude over multiple generations. The body, denied sufficient oxygen per breath, demands more breaths. The chest cavity widens to accommodate that demand. It is not an advantage, it is a symptom. The long bones carry additional markers. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains indicates elevated red blood cell production, consistent with chronic hypoxic stress. The body's standing order to manufacture more oxygen carrying capacity than it was ever designed to need. While the precise isotope ratios are currently undergoing final peer review as part of the 2026 Tugunbulak osteology report, the preliminary data is definitive. These are not the skeletons of people who occasionally visited high altitude. The average AGA death profile from the sampled remains skews young, significantly young. The altitude was one problem. The furnaces were another. Dental calculus, the calcified plaque that accumulates on teeth over a lifetime and preserves a chemical record of what the body absorbed from multiple Tugunbulak individuals, shows elevated concentrations of lead, arsenic, and iron particulate. These are not dietary markers, they are inhalation markers. The lungs process them first. What the lungs could not filter, the bloodstream carried, and what the bloodstream carried eventually deposited into the calcifying matrix around the teeth. The rib remains compound the picture. In several individuals, the interior surfaces of the ribs show periosteal inflammation consistent with chronic pulmonary irritation. The skeletal signature of lungs that spent years processing particulate and air. This is the condition that historians of industrial medicine will recognize from 19th century coal mining contexts. Except that Tugunbulak precedes the Industrial Revolution by roughly 700 years. The shelters adjacent to the production zones were not built for ventilation. Highland construction at altitude prioritizes heat retention above everything else. Thick walls, low ceilings, minimal apertures. A room that holds warmth also holds smoke. A furnace worker who spent a 12-hour shift tending a smelting hearth, then retired to sleep in a low-ceiling shelter where the air carried residual particulate, was being damaged continuously during production and during rest. The city produced exceptional steel. Its workers died in many cases before they reached 35. The steel itself demands explanation, because it was not ordinary iron. The process used at Tugunbulak belongs to the tradition's Central Asian metallurgical sources referred to as pulad, term that will eventually travel westward and contribute to the Persian and Arabic vocabulary for high-quality steel. And from there, into the European concept of what the best cutting metal should be. The pulad process is categorically different from the bloomery iron production dominant in medieval Europe and much of the contemporary Islamic world. Bloomery production yields wrought iron, serviceable, malleable, but relatively low in carbon content, and therefore limited in hardness and edge retention. Pulad is crucible steel. The distinction is fundamental. In crucible production, iron and carbon-bearing organic material, specific plant matter, sometimes bone, sometimes a precise combination of both, are sealed inside a ceramic vessel and subjected to sustained high heat. The sealed environment allows carbon to migrate into the iron matrix under controlled conditions, producing a high-carbon steel with a crystalline microstructure that bloomery iron cannot replicate. The result holds an edge longer, fractures less predictably, and can be worked into shapes that wrought iron cannot sustain. The 2026 survey located clusters of refractory clay extraction pits, Near the Tugunbulak production zone, specialized clay with high alumina content capable of surviving repeated thermal cycling without contaminating the melt. While the full mineralogical characterization of these samples is the subject of ongoing 2026 laboratory analysis, their purpose is unmistakable. These were not general-purpose ceramic deposits. The pits were exploited specifically for crucible construction. The volume implied is substantial. Sustaining that volume required fuel on a scale the highland environment could not indefinitely support. Anthracological analysis, the study of charcoal fragments recovered from the production zones, shows a clear directional pattern across the site's operational centuries. Early-phase charcoal samples are dominated by juniper, the primary highland tree species available within immediate proximity to the site. Later-phase samples show a progressive shift, less juniper, increasing proportions of almond and lower elevation, scrub species that required transport from significantly further down the mountain slopes. The forest was being consumed faster than it could regenerate, and the city's fuel supply lines were lengthening with each generation of production. This was not a slow or invisible process. The people managing Tugunbulak's fuel logistics would have watched the juniper line, a retreat upslope within a working lifetime. They adapted, extending supply routes, organizing labor for charcoal production at lower elevations, absorbing the additional transport cost into the city's operational structure. They kept the furnaces running. The steel that came out of those furnaces did not stay in the highlands. It moved along routes that connected Tugunbulak to the broader Silk Road network, into a geopolitical economy that would be shaped and in some respects controlled by whoever held reliable access to this quality of metal. That question of control is where the history of this city becomes something larger than metallurgy. Iron is leverage. In the 9th and 10th century CE, whoever controlled the highest quality steel supply in Central Asia controlled the terms of every negotiation conducted with a blade, the Karakhanids. Khanid understood this precisely. The Karakhanids were Turkic, pastoralist in origin, without the deep urban administrative tradition of the Iranian Sogdian cities they were displacing. Samarkand, Bukhara, and the established Sogdian trading centers had centuries of institutional infrastructure, tax systems, merchant networks, architectural prestige, literate bureaucracies. The Karakhanids had horses, mobile armies, and after consolidating control of the highland production zones, including Tugunbulak iron, specifically, they had Pulad, the best cutting steel available in the medieval Islamic world. Produced at altitude in a city that most of their rivals did not fully understand and could not easily threaten. This is not a metaphor. It is a supply chain analysis. A Karakhanid military commander, equipped with high-carbon crucible steel weapons, held a material advantage over opponents using bloomery iron. The advantage was not decisive in every engagement, but across a sustained campaign, it was cumulative and real. Better edges, better armor penetration. Tools and weapons that held their geometry under sustained use rather than deforming. The highlands produced something the lowlands needed, and the Karakhanids positioned themselves between the furnaces and the demand. Control of Tugunbulak was, in operational terms, a strategic asset, not unlike controlling a mountain pass, except that this particular asset produced the weapons that made mountain passes worth defending. In 2026, the question of where Tugunbulak's iron actually traveled shifted from historical inference to measurable fact. The isotopic signature of ore from the Pamir highland geology around Tugunbulak is distinctive. It does not match the signatures of competing production centers in the Caucasus, Anatolia, or the Iranian Plateau. While the full dataset and site inventory are being finalized for publication in Nature, Materials and Associated Smithsonian reports this year, the initial mapping is revolutionary. The preliminary findings are unambiguous in their geographic reach. Tugunbulak's isotopic signature has been identified in metal artifacts recovered from sites near the Aral Sea Basin, roughly 800 kilometers to the northwest. The same signature appears in blade fragments from the eastern Taklamakan desert margin, more than 1,500 kilometers to the east. These are not neighboring markets. These are the endpoints of major Silk Road arteries. Tugunbulak iron was not supplying a regional economy. It was moving through the primary channels of intercontinental trade. Every arrowhead carrying that isotopic signature is a data point on a distribution map. the map as it currently stands. It describes a city that functioned as a continental-scale supplier of military-grade metal for at least 2 centuries. The 10th century geographer Al-Makadisi visited or gathered detailed accounts from those who had visited Marsmanda, and recorded what he found with the pragmatic precision characteristic of the best medieval geographic writing. He described it as cold. He noted the altitude without sentimentality, and he documented the fares. Monthly iron markets. Traders coming up the mountain specifically to buy what Marsmanda produced. The thin air was the price of admission. Steel was the reason to pay it. Consider what that journey required. A merchant traveling from Samarkand to Marsmanda in the 10th century was ascending more than 1,000 meters in elevation. Moving from a temperate urban environment into a high-altitude plateau, where the cold was serious and the air noticeably thinner, they carried trade goods up. They carried iron down. They did this monthly because the iron was worth it, worth the physical cost, worth the road time, worth the altitude sickness that any lowlander would have experienced on first ascent. Al-Makadisi was not writing promotional literature. He was documenting a functioning economic node. The fares at Marsmanda were unremarkable to him in the sense that they were simply part of how the region worked. That casualness is itself significant. This was not an exotic curiosity. It was ordinary commerce, conducted at extraordinary altitude, for a product that had no equivalent elsewhere. In 2026, the survey team published a comparison that reframes everything. Tugunbulak, at its operational peak, covered a physical footprint comparable to Pompeii. 2 cities separated by a millennium and a continent built to roughly the same scale. Pompeii is one of the most studied archaeological sites on Earth. Tugunbulak was, until the Lidar returns came in, a marginal notation in the literature of Central Asian medieval urbanism. The difference is not significance. The difference is altitude and visibility. Pompeii was buried in an afternoon. Tugunbulak was forgotten across a generation. Its workers leaving, its furnaces cooling, its refractory clay pits silting over with highland sediment. No ash preserved it. No dramatic stridography marked the moment of ending. What preserved it was the cold, the elevation, the fact that no subsequent civilization found the plateau worth developing. The LiDAR does not lie about scale. The isotope data does not lie about reach. The dental calculus does not lie about cost. A city the size of Pompeii ran industrial steel production at 2,000 meters for 3 centuries. Supplied weapons to an empire, and left behind workers whose bodies recorded every year of it in bone and tooth and calcified lung tissue. It ran until the wood was gone, the water uncertain, and the political will exhausted. Then the mountain took it back. The data is still coming in. The story of Marsmanda reminds us that progress is often a fragile negotiation with the environment. We tend to view the ruins of the past as failures, but for 3 centuries, the people of the Pamir Highlands won. They built an industrial titan where the air itself was an enemy. They didn't vanish because they were weak. They vanished because the systems they relied on, the forests, the climate, and the trade routes were no longer willing to negotiate. As we look at our own global supply chains and industrial footprints in 2026, the silence of Tugunbulak is a mirror. It is a reminder that even the most advanced technology is eventually subject to the ground it is built upon. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the thin air of the Silk Road. If you found this dive into the Iron City insightful, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. It is the best way to support the deep dive research we do here. I want to hear from you in the comments. Does the idea of a lost Pompeii in the mountains change how you view the history of the Silk Road? And if you were a merchant in the 10th century, would you have braved the black lung for a blade of Marsmanda steel? I want to thank you for watching Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore. Until the next whisper, stay curious and stay safe.